So now that we've talked about the connection and messaging APIs in RSocket, look primarily from the client perspective, let's talk about how these things are integrated into Spring. And this will give us a chance to talk about the server side as well. So you can use RSocket without any connection or relationship to Spring whatsoever. That's really what it's designed for originally. And if you take a look at this link at the bottom of the slide, that's where you'll find the pointers to the GitHub repositories that have the C++ and Python and JavaScript and Java implementations that are kind of standalone. However, for my experience, for the kinds of things we're doing, it's generally a lot more effective and a lot more efficient, especially in terms of human programmer time, to leverage Spring's integration of RSocket. And Spring applications that use RSocket typically don't need to be concerned with some of the lower level APIs at all. In fact, they kind of deprecate them and they're hard to get to, and those things have changed over time. So you're much better off sticking at the higher level in general, which can be a little confusing when you're reading things online and it's not clear whether they're talking about RSocket as the original protocol and frameworks that are independent of Spring or the Spring integration. Not surprisingly, now that you've seen Spring for a whole semester, Spring enables the integration of RSocket into a controller using, wait for it, annotations. And there's a couple of annotations, actually 3 of them that are very important. The first is controller, which is not the REST controller, but it's a controller that enables the auto detection of implementation classes via class path scanning. So you've seen this a million times before, just in the REST context for the RESTful controllers, but same basic idea. Here's some things that are a little different. One is an annotation called connect mapping. And this is what's used on the server side to designate a method, an endpoint handler method that handles connection level events, such as setup events, metadata, push events, and so on. And these can be used for various purposes, but they're most commonly used for authentication purposes. And we'll see some examples when we get into the case study here in just a bit. There's also another mechanism that's called message mapping. And as that name may suggest, it's an endpoint annotation that maps a message to an endpoint message handling method by matching the pattern in the method, or sorry, in the message metadata to the destination that's described using the message mapping annotation. So it's basically very similar to things like get mapping or post mapping, but it's used for RSocket messages rather than HTTP messages. Now, you typically combine all these things together in various ways. So let's take a couple of looks at some examples, and we'll look at this in more detail later, but this is just to kind of set the groundwork. So we're going to have this Zippy application, this Zippy quotes application, similar to what we've looked at before. And we're going to have 2 controllers and 2 services. The first controller is called the Zippy Connect controller. And as the name may suggest, it handles connect events. And therefore, it has a connect mapping annotation that says the handle connect method is going to be used to handle connection events for this particular RSocket server. And of course, you designate them by passing with the message as part of the metadata, the name of the endpoint connect mapper. So in this case, it would be server connect, which is just a string that probably says server connect. And so this is used by the Spring RSocket implementation to route the incoming connection request to the appropriate handler. Endpoints can also handle messages. So we also have a Zippy message controller, which is different from the Zippy Connect controller that handles the message requests. And not surprisingly, we have message mapping annotations for those things. We have subscribe, get all quotes, get quotes, there's cancel subscribe, all kinds of stuff like that. And once again, we use these path names to tell Spring how to route the incoming message requests to the appropriate endpoint handlers that handle messages as opposed to connection events. Something else to note here that's very important, these endpoints can take a mono or a flux parameter, and they can also return a mono or a flux result as the return value. It's also possible to use other Java reference types, including RSocket requester. You can pass RSocket requesters around, and in fact, that's precisely what you typically do with the connection mapper method. It takes the RSocket requester from the client and then can use that to call back to the client to do various kinds of things. So the use of these Project Reactor mono and flux types give us a lot of flexibility. It enables client and server code to run reactively across host or process boundaries, to talk across hosts and processes. So it's basically a message passing middleware mechanism. And that, of course, supports asynchronous message passing, which is very cool. I should also mention just briefly that all the other Spring annotations that you know and love, or not all of them, but many of the ones that you know and love, are also seamlessly integratable with RSocket. So, for example, you can have beans that are factories that make things, and you can also have auto wiring to auto wire the results of those beans. And we'll actually take a look at this shortly, where we're going to have a test program that's going to have a private zippy quote requester field that's of type mono to RSocket requester. And we're going to have a bean that's going to go ahead and be auto wired to produce the appropriate RSocket requester mono after setting up connection with the server. So the good news is, if you know Spring, it's very familiar. And that's one of the reasons why I like using RSocket with Spring, because it's very easy lift from what we've already been studying. That's the end of our discussion of integrating the RSocket APIs into Spring.